Hello, renegade thinkers. Here's the situation. You're 11 months on the job. You've built your team. You've rebuilt your brand and your website. You've raised $117 million in venture funding, and all eyes are on growth to get that to that magical $100 million annual revenue threshold. If you've been at a startup, you know how important that one is. And then kaboom, all hell breaks loose. The pandemic not only shuts down your city, but also much of the world's commerce. Physical events are canceled. Events that you depend on for leads are just gone. Some of your customers are hit severely, some not so much. So the big question is, do you pivot? Do you change your messaging? And if so, to what? To answer these and other pressing questions, including how can you juggle being a CMO and having to homeschool your 10-year-old, my guest today is Jakki Geiger, the CMO of Reltio, a customer data platform. Hi, Jakki. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Drew. Thanks for having me.
You know, it just occurred to me that I hope I said Reltio right.
Yep, you said Reltio right. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. Good. So it's been, gosh, about a month since our prep call. How are you holding up?
I'm doing all right. You know, a lot has changed since our last conversation with the markets and also with the social injustice that's raised itself as a topic of conversation. So I think it's an interesting time for CMOs because I think, 5 years ago, CMOs didn't have to think about global pandemics and what their position on racial injustice is and whether they want to make a stand. But now CMOs are being asked to step up as I think even stronger leaders within their organizations to contribute to these conversations.
It's so true, and I want to go back to that. But so let's just so our listeners can picture it. Where are you right now?
So I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area in my home. I've converted a spare bedroom into a home office. And I've been working from here, and sometimes I go outside from time to time just to get some fresh air and do some Zoom calls from there.
Nice. And how's it going with your daughter? I mean, you have to sort of be teacher too.
Yeah, actually I have a son, 10-year-old son, and I have to say, I'm really glad with how he's adapted to all this. If there's any positive that's come from this for him is he's learned to be more independent and how to get stuff done on his own, which he wasn't doing at all before the pandemic. So it's kind of forced him to mature a little bit and be able to take care of some things that he never had to really worry about before.
You know, it's so funny you should say that because I often provide this advice to young parents in particular. My advice goes like this: do nothing for your children. And they look at me with weird eyes and they sort of, what do you mean? And I mean, literally make them do everything.
Yeah.
Make them cook, make them clean, make them do everything. So they get a sense of accomplishment and independence at an early age. It's a gift that gives, their entire lives. But it's funny that it took this change for you to go, oh, well, this is good for him.
Absolutely. And he's the only child, so we tended to pamper him a little bit more.
Right.
But now he's responsible for his pets. He's got to feed his pets. He cleans the table, fills up the dishwasher. So he's learning a whole bunch of new skills.
Excellent. All right. Well, we're all learning a bunch of new skills at this time. And it's been so interesting. And you've joined a couple of the CMO huddles that we've been doing since April, beginning of April. What's amazing is that every single week it feels like there is a new transformative issue that we need to cover as a group and really talk about it. And you just mentioned the notion, the latest in terms of how CMOs have to help guide their companies in the area of, I like to think of it as anti-racism. Talk a little bit about that and how that your company is confronting that challenge.
Sure. So I'll take it personally first because for me, I grew up in Canada. So this deep-seated racism wasn't something I grew up with. I have African-American friends. We don't talk about racism. It's just not something that we put on the table as a topic of discussion. Well, I would say for the last 2 weeks, I've been engaging with them all and saying, tell me, what has it been like for you? Tell me about your experience. I want to learn. So for me, it's been listening and learning and seeking to understand a lot more than I ever have before. The second piece for me was what can I personally do? The CMO of a mid-sized startup in Silicon Valley, what can I do to make a difference? And I felt like I couldn't do anything at first. And then I realized I can. This is about human beings. This is about being human to each other. Every interaction counts. Every interaction is an opportunity to drive change. And so I realized that my voice on this topic is really important. As a leadership team, we must address this. And it can't just be, a post on social media. We really need to take a good look within our organization and say, let's examine ourselves. Are we doing everything we can? How can we have discussions about this in small groups? So that's what we've done. We've decided we're going to start within our own organization, start bringing this up as a topic of conversation in small groups where people can just share their experiences. But we also want to bring this to customers and our partners and make sure we're all doing our part. And the second piece was donating to the causes we believe are helping, those people on the front lines who are fighting against the racial discrimination that's going on. So we've made a couple of strategic donations that we feel really good about as well.
It's such an interesting conversation, and one that I've been giving a lot of thought to, particularly in the context of what CMOs can do. And I shared a email with a bunch of CMOs recently on it, including a reading list. And on the top of that reading list is a book called White Fragility. And it's fascinating, and I'm about a third of the way done. But there are a couple of things that just strike me as, it is just, if you are white, you just have no idea. And you may think you are absolutely the most unracist person, but you've never had to deal with color. And it doesn't matter if African Americans or Blacks are your friends. You just haven't had to deal with it. So one of the things that's really struck me is a new term, is the term anti-racist. It's not enough to just acknowledge it. You have to do something about it. And that's an acknowledgement and a step forward that I think feels a little different than previous times when this has been an issue for 400 years.
Right.
But it's really come to the forefront. And I think a number of folks have sort of stepped back and said, whoa, this is so systemic that if we don't, and people who are in a position to make a difference, if we don't do it, what are we doing here? So anyway, I'm off my pulpit, we'll be publishing it on renegade.com shortly, so you can go and check it out. Actually, by the time this episode airs, it'll already be on there. Anyway, so let's talk about being virtual. In our prep call, you said that you had to change your management style a little bit as a result of being virtual. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I'm a big fan of being in person with people because you can see the verbal nonverbals. But even on calls with my teammates who've been remote, it's usually been on a phone. And what I've decided to do is really make sure that we're visible on video. Doesn't matter if our hair is not done or if our makeup's not done. Like, we've just kind of forgotten about all that. We don't need to be dressed up, but we all can see each other and we can see each other every day. And I think it's so important for leaders in particular to make sure that we have a physical presence and that we can see people and see how they're feeling. That's another, challenge through the global pandemic and everything we're going through, is like really making sure your teams are okay. And taking a look at them and saying, are you sure you're okay? Is there anything I can do? Because it's a very stressful time. So yes, working remotely has been a challenge, but I actually think it's brought us closer together. I have a theory that going to battle with your team creates the strongest bond. And that's how I feel, right? My whole team came together. My last 3 hires were January, February, March. We've all worked remotely. We haven't had a planning meeting in person, but we seem to be doing really well as a team, figuring it all out virtually.
Well, that's great. That's great to hear. One of the things that's interesting, an interesting dynamic that I keep hearing about, is how do you make sure that your direct reports are actually being honest with you in the Zoom setting? Whereas if a meeting happened in person, at the end of the meeting, one of your direct reports might have said to you, I'm not sure I agree, but I didn't want to bring it up in front of everybody else. And so how are you making sure these little sidebar conversations and this input is not, and that you actually have good discussions and good input from your team, an honest input?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I have 3 leaders who manage teams of about 3 people. And what we do is we have a regular weekly team meeting, and we do it Scrum style. I don't know if we've ever chatted about this,
Sure.
but we do it Scrum style, where we say, what did you accomplish last week? What are you working on this week? and what's blocking you? Do you have a solution, or do you need help? And do you need my help in particular to help eliminate any obstacles? So we have that kind of a discussion. We operate on a weekly cadence. So the teams share what the plans are every single week. We provide input. Have you thought of this, thought of that? So we have a good sort of team dynamic. I also have weekly one-on-ones with each of my leaders. And some of the people who don't report directly to me have bi-weekly check-ins with me as well. So my goal is always to say, you know, I want to be transparent. I want to be direct. I want this to be the best career experience you've ever had. So please be honest and open with me. Keeping things to yourself that could make a difference isn't going to help anybody. So if you disagree with something, bring it up. Like, that's why we're all here together, because we have different viewpoints and we're going to be better together.
Interesting. And have you found that the one-on-one conversations are different than the sort of scrums, and that you're really getting at sort of when there are disagreements, that they've sort of come out, and that you're able to get sort of, I think the hardest thing for CMOs is to get honest input.
I agree. So in my one-on-ones, I really say the agenda is yours. This isn't my meeting. This is your meeting. What do you want to talk about? But I always ask the question, how are you doing? How's your team doing? Anything going on that I can help with, or that you're trying to solve for, where I can provide some useful guidance and advice. So I try to encourage that kind of transparency with my team members. And a couple times things have come up where it's like, oh my goodness, yeah, that's an interesting thing you're dealing with. Let's talk about how you can either deal with that directly, or how I may be able to help, or how you can help this person come to some kind of decision or opinion, right?
Right. Yeah, suddenly, how are you is a much more loaded question.
Yes, it is. It's more like, how are you doing? You know?
Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And it's not, oh, fine, which is the natural answer, because no, there's some really interesting challenges. And we have been talking about sort of all the challenges that the pandemic has presented in terms of marketing and messaging, but we haven't specifically addressed what I talked about in the opening, which is you looked at your message when this pandemic broke, and you made a decision to walk away from it. Talk a little bit about where you were and that moment of panic. It must have been panic.
It was. I mean, we just launched our new website. We just launched all our new positioning, messaging, our level 0, level 1 decks. Like, our messaging was baked. We had our messaging guide, positioning guide. We sent it out. We were so excited, reviewed it with customers, partners, got all the validation. And then the pandemic hit. And the key message, Drew, was, you know, you need connected customer data to win in the experience economy. We were associating ourselves with the winners, with the data innovators who were planning to win in this experience economy. And so when we looked around at what was happening around the world, and, you know, I actually had a former colleague who was in Italy and died of COVID. So for me, it was particularly a hard time in March, where I was like, oh my goodness, this is like affecting people's lives. It's taking people away whom we really appreciate in our world. And now they're gone because of this. And I don't know if the right messaging right now is about winning and losing. Like, it just feels tone deaf. So we took a step back and we said, you know, how can we reposition ourselves without getting too far away from our core, but to think about, what are people trying to do right now? They're not trying to win, but they are trying to protect their customers. They're trying to retain their customers. They're trying to serve their customers as their needs change. So we came up with a new main message that we put on our website and in our content that was all about, you know, serving, protecting, and retaining those customers. And the way you were going to do that is if you had more data about them, if you could really understand their needs through data.
And it's so interesting, you know, the game metaphor, when this isn't a game, is, and it's as simple as that, is that this isn't a game, this is like a real life, and businesses are struggling for survival. And you're right. And I can see totally how that the notion of competitive edge and so forth. There's also something sort of, in some ways, serve, protect, and retain has that nice customer centricity that I think would be somewhat refreshing, but also never is, you know, it's like, when would it ever be a bad time to serve, protect, and retain your customers? Never. So you have the language. So, and how quickly, first of all, how long did it take you to get from winning won't work to serve, protect, and retain?
I would say probably 3 days.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay, those were a long 3 days.
it was a real long 3 days, but we wanted to make sure that we validated with our field teams, right? The sales people who are talking with prospects every day, the SCs, our CSMs. We want to do a little bit of validation, and then as a leadership team, wanted to make sure we had the buy-in that this was pretty significant. I mean, to winning in the experience economy was a several month process of all agreeing that this was our direction, and so to make the change, I wanted to make sure we weren't doing it in a silo.
And interesting, I had a somewhat similar conversation where the CMO actually went to her leadership team and said, "We're not doing this exactly by the book. Are you okay?" Because I mean, in 3 days, you can't possibly do the process that you went through to get to where you were. But in your gut, you knew you couldn't go with what you had, and you can't not have anything. So what were some of the critical things that helped you sort of sell this notion into to the senior leaders of the organization?
I think because it wasn't a huge pivot.
Mm-hmm.
Like the serve, protect, and retain was kind of built into what it would take to win anyway. So it wasn't like I was asking for a departure. It was like, let's just lead with a different message, like a subset of the message of winning. Part of that is about serving, retaining, and protecting. So let's elevate that and put that in the forefront instead.
I see. So, okay, we're just sort of emphasizing what was the lead promise and bringing out sort of the core pillars of that promise. Okay, that makes sense. So they were on board with that. And then how quickly were you able to then turn, you had mentioned you had produced all this other work to sort of, you would have had to go through every single piece of content and revise it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
everything.
Yes. So luckily, most of the content was on the web, which, luckily we
Right.
use WordPress, so it was pretty easy to change. And some of the assets that were in development, wherever it said win, we would just change the language. So because we had just repositioned, we didn't have a ton of sort of printed or content that was not easy to change. So while it was a laborious process, it took a while. There wasn't as much as it would have been if we had had this messaging for like a year, for example.
Right. It's not like it was entrenched or suddenly, you were going to market with something that was so, right. Okay. So when did you have a sense that this new messaging was going to work? Assuming it has worked, what have some of the responses to it been?
Yeah, so that was the macro level message about serve, protect, retain. We also took a deeper look at our core value proposition, like what differentiates us from the competition. We felt like it was important to kind of double click on that a little bit. And where we landed was on this idea of responsiveness. Like what really differentiates our technology from all the other vendors out there is a data leader's ability to respond faster. So that's what we really tested. We thought, my goodness, like customer needs have changed, right? We have customers, I should say, across life sciences, healthcare, retail, CPG, high tech. And in all of these cases, many of them had some digital initiative going on, some transformation going on. And boy, did everything just get accelerated, right? All the barriers, the organizational barriers, the, huge cultural change that happens in the global 2000 to make something like that happen just disappeared. And it was like, we need to make this happen because customers need to connect with us through digital channels.
Right.
So this idea that, wow, suddenly all of your customer communications are going through digital channels. For example, some retailers, their store associates couldn't be in the stores anymore. The stores were closed. They were now working remotely from home. The customer call centers that were normally together, the sales teams that were normally together are now all working remotely. So this ability to respond quickly to your customers' changing needs, you've got to be where they are, was a big message we used underneath that serve, protect, and retain. That how you communicate with customers, engage with them, and interact has changed. So you need to be able to respond faster in order to be effective. So that's the messaging we really tested. We just thought, let's just run a webinar. We'll see how much interest we get from our global 2000 prospect accounts. And we saw a really good number of people who registered for that. We thought, there's something there. This ability to pivot quickly is something people need right now. So let's test a few more things before we make a big investment. We're going to test, we're going to learn, and then we're going to scale it. And so that's what we've been doing.
And and did responsiveness become the sort of big winner in this?
Yes, it did. Because, if you think about all the ways a company needs to respond today, right? The customer needs have been the most important. And then the infrastructure, right? If you're going mostly digital, you need to scale up your infrastructure to manage all that digital engagement that's happening with customers. So your infrastructure needs to be responsive. Your ability to respond to customers' changing needs, you need to be able to respond to that. But there's also regulations like the California Privacy Act. It's been delayed a little bit, but it's around the corner. So being able to respond quickly to regulations, organizational changes. Now you have a call center store associate that are working from home. How do you adjust to that organizational change and operational changes? So there's all these different ways companies have needed to respond through all this. And if your data platform doesn't support that, you're going to feel like a snail, like you're operating more slowly. You can't be as responsive as you'd like, and you're holding your business back. So that's the type of messaging that seems to be resonating right now with the people that are our targets.
So what's interesting to me right now, in particularly in the world of software and B2B, is there's a challenge in that business is up, down, all over the place, and it's certainly uncertain. And so I'm only going to make investments in things that one CMO phrased it as speed to value, something that I can get value out of right away. And that's a hard thing to do, because in a lot of software cases, showing value is, it's ROIs are difficult models to prove in many situations. So in implying and sort of selling the notion of responsiveness so your customers could be more responsive, was there anything implicit that your software would quickly be responsive to their needs? I don't know. I'm really stretching here.
Absolutely. No, not at all. So if you look at some of the research in CIOs within CIO circles, what do you need right now, CIO or chief data officers? What they need the most right now is this agility. They need speed, agility, and fast time to value. If you look at the cost cutting that's been happening, CFOs have been working closely with CIOs and their data leaders to say, what investments can we cut? Because we want to conserve cash right now, right? So the investments that have been preserved are around digital and around customer experience. Those have gone mostly unscathed, which is great to see. And so what CIOs and CDOs have been challenged by their CFOs to say is, well, how can we make faster progress on these initiatives? So they need that agility, speed, and fast time to value. And so in response to that, we actually created a package where we worked with our professional services team, we worked with sales, and we said, you know what? Prospects need something faster. Traditionally, this software takes longer to set up, right?
Right.
We said, you know what if we could affect them in 1 quarter? What if in 1 quarter they could have connected customer data so that they could power these initiatives with an enterprise view of their data instead of a departmental view of their data? That would add value. So we created this package called the Fast Start. And so far, it's been going pretty well for us.
Well, that's, and I've talked a lot about that we put out this B2B demand gen guide recently, and that is really a big component. If you can come up with a product that inherently delivers on speed, right?
Yeah.
With that promise, you're going to get a lot of attention. Now, you did mention CFOs, and I'm wondering, were they even in the picture pre-COVID? CFOs?
Sometimes,
Right.
one thing I should mention is what we sell is enterprise data around customers, right? And so these aren't really high velocity deals. We don't close these deals in a very short period of time. It's usually like about a 9-month sales cycle. There's multiple stakeholders involved. And sometimes the deal sizes are big enough where the CFO does sign off and give us approval. But in terms of, pre-COVID and post-COVID, yeah, CFOs are taking a much sharper look at all investments that are happening within a company right now. I would say even ours, right? Every time I want to make an investment now, I review it with our CFO, whereas in the past, I didn't do that.
Yeah, exactly. So they're suddenly more involved, and everything is about a very, very hard look at, do I need to do this now?
Yes.
Right? Can I push this back? And so from your business standpoint, as you've made, how important were events to your business from a lead flow standpoint?
Critical. It was our biggest marketing investment. We had 8 major events coming up, including our big customer conference. We were expecting to have 400 customers and partners. which is a great opportunity to bring customers together. They share their stories, they network. It also presents a lot of expansion opportunities. We bring prospects, so it drives pipeline. It gets partners more committed and excited to work with us. So, it was a critically important event. It was supposed to happen in May in San Francisco. We were supposed to be there just a few weeks ago. And unfortunately, we needed to make the call to say it's not the right time. So yeah, events are very, very important to our business. We had to quickly pivot. Webinars were not really a core part of our strategy. We were going to do maybe a webinar every couple of months, but we decided to shift all of our physical event investment into virtual event investments. And so my team quickly pivoted, and we got 6 webinars done from March, or I would say late February until today. And it's actually been the second biggest source of pipeline for us. So I'm really glad that we did that.
And are you seeing any webinar fatigue?
Yes. We're seeing fatigue on a number of fronts, right? So I would say the database, emailing the database, high value asset offers, webinars, we're seeing lower open rates. We're experimenting a lot, like what subject lines are resonating, what aren't. And then landing pages, how do we really optimize those to capture everybody who's there? How do we motivate them to want to provide that information or register for an event? So we're definitely seeing fatigue across the board. And one thing is loud and clear is we really need to expand our database. That's going to be a big focus for us in the second half.
Yeah. And I think, there are a lot of webinars. It's funny because we've talked about virtual events a lot in our CMO huddles, and the first ones, it was just get them out the door as quickly as possible. And now they're getting better. And I think the same thing has to happen with webinars. I attended one the other day, and it was like 40 minutes of the brand and then 10 minutes of the customer. And then there was not enough time for questions. And it's like, let's flip that. It didn't get interesting until the end. But I also think the quality of the speakers, the quality of the way these things are produced, everything has to get better because, we're now competing with just my email. Like a webinar competes with email, right? I could attend. It's the same thing with podcasts. I could listen to this podcast, or I could go do my email, or I could get on a Zoom call. And so I think the quality bar is going to have to go up, which means the insight bar has to go up. And so as you look ahead and you say, we need more leads, how do you see yourself generating those?
Yeah, so those 8 events were supposed to be very big contributors to the expansion of our database. So we're getting really creative right now. One of the things that we're doing is really exploring how we can get much more targeted with PPC. We've seen quite a bit of success with LinkedIn in particular because it has a lot more targeting capabilities than just Google Ads, for example. So really sharpening up on PPC is one area in particular. We're also exploring virtual field marketing events where we work very closely with the sales team to identify what are the key accounts that we really want to get the right buying center, right? Drew, it's not just about one individual, but we want to get that whole buying center engaged. How do we do that? How do we research the right contacts and really understand the account? Because as you know, different industries are impacted differently right now. Travel and hospitality, not the same as life sciences in terms of what they're focused on, right? But even within that industry, in hospitality, there are some companies that are investing in customer experience in digital right now, and others that are more in just cost-cutting preservation mode. So it's really being able to take a much more, I would say, ABM or personalized, I call it hyper-personalized approach. I think in general, marketers are realizing we need to be hyper-personalized. How can we learn as much as we can about an account, about a buying center? How do we get as much data in our hands as we can so that when we do get a message through, it resonates because they see, they understand our business.
I think virtual field events is one of the more fun and interesting things. There's a lot more interesting things going on. I've heard of pizza casts and wine tasting and whiskey tasting and all sorts of really fun things. Have you come up with an angle that you're starting to see work in field events?
So we are just dipping our toes into field events. We're literally having our first one this month. So I will let you know. But Drew, I must say, when you invited me to that CMO huddle, that was incredibly valuable because I think the challenge we have right now is there's no playbook. And webinars are good because you can learn some things from other people. But what was really valuable about that huddle you put together is that we all got to talk and ask questions and discuss topics that were of importance to us, right? And so that's where I want my team to go with our events. How do we bring these really smart people together and have them talk amongst themselves and ask questions and find out how each of them are succeeding with various things? So for me, I would like to go away from presenting and more towards how do we create engagement. And, yes, the whiskey tastings and all that, I can't wait to experiment with those and see how they go, because I think it'll make it a much more fun experience. But I think just allowing people that venue to talk, to network, because they're missing it. They're not doing events anymore. That's what we used to do at events, right?
It's true. It's true. Yeah, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about how to even up that in the huddle. So, okay, we're going to wrap this up. I think there are a lot of interesting things that we've talked about besides just the expanding role of CMOs. And I want to go from a pivot standpoint. If you were advising a CMO who was in a similar situation where suddenly they realized the message that they had thought was going to be the winner wasn't, what are two do's and a don't for pivoting this quickly from one story to a new improved story?
Yeah, so I think it really starts with your core, right? So one thing I didn't mention is we took a really hard look at our vision and our mission, because when you're repositioning, you don't want to go too far away from that. So our mission has been to power the experiences of the future with the data that matters most to your company. So we didn't go too far away from that with our serve, protect, and retain with connected customer data, right? And I think that's something to really look at is, why are you here as a company? What purpose do you serve as a company? And how do you just take the message you've got and tweak it so that it's more in tune with the current situation? And I think, messaging is usually a 1 year type of thing, right? We're going to lock this in. We're going to have it for a year. We're going to see how it goes. But I think marketing leaders, I think this whole ability to pivot and moving from live events to digital and shifting our messaging, I think we're just going to need to be more nimble leaders in general and be more open to revisiting things that are, this is the way we've done it, or this is the way we do it. I think it's going to be sort of the new playbook moving forward, is just having more agility ourselves. So I would say don't go too far away from your core, right? It really needs to still resonate with that customer, that prospect. That, I guess that would be my main advice. Stick to the values, what's critically important to your customers about you, and don't stray too far.
There you go. Okay. Jakki Geiger, CMO Reltio, thank you so much for being on the show. To the listeners, I'm gonna highlight a couple of things that I think are really interesting that I want you to sort of key takeaways here. Is agility is an asset. Period. It always is an asset, but it's a mindset that says, I'm listening, I'm ready, and I'm able to pivot if needed. But what was so, as you tied it back to your mission and vision, it's not like we're Ricochet Rabbit where we're going bing, 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 going from one thing to another. You're grounded in something. Another thing that you said that you powered through really quickly was, based on where you're going, you then tested and sort of used webinars as a way of sort of message testing, which I thought was really interesting. And I haven't really heard CMOs talk about it that way. So you put a toe in the water. Oh, this one's working. Let's go with that until that one doesn't work. And I think that test and learn approach is really smart. Again, assuming it ties back to why. So, and then finally, at the very beginning of the conversation, we talked about the need for CMOs to be aware of the world that we operate in. No company is a bubble. No CMO is a bubble. And if anybody were going to solve some of these big issues like systemic racism, it's going to be leaders like the ones listening to the show. So Jakki, thank you.
Thank you, Drew.
And to my listeners, until next time, keep those renegade thinking caps on and strong.